some practical ideas on how to solve some of the issues involved with ornamentation. And it's not just Bach with this issue. We know it's with Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven and even Chopin. You know, there's always questions about how to interpret these trill signs and other kinds of ornaments. The famous novelist W. Somerset Maugham once said this about on writing novels. He said, "There are 3 rules for writing a novel. Unfortunately, no one knows what they are." And now he was saying that in jest, but I think there's a certain relevance of that remark with regard also to ornamentation. I think we are all people that would like to have definite rules so that every time you see an ornament sign, you know exactly how it should be played. And there's no ifs, ands, and buts about it. There's a certain, I would call it an urtext mentality that we often have nowadays. You know, we have these beautiful editions that come out that are based on the latest scholarship and everything, having examined the original manuscripts and all these kinds of things, and coming up with an urtext, which is a very clean copy, and what the scholars would think would be the final version of a piece if Bach himself were around to publish it and say, this is the way it should be. And it goes along with our liking for definite rules, but that we look at a page and we think, well, all we have to do is just play those notes and we'll be fine. And we can depend on an urtext edition to be able to do that. Now, I think urtext editions are great, but there's a certain temptation, I think, sometimes, to think that what Bach wrote is the absolute end of all interpretation, and that all we have to do is just play the notes, hopefully with some expression. But it turns out that Bach himself and the composers in the Baroque period, and in the classical period to a certain extent too, tended to be quite free in their playing of things. So one time they might play it one way, and another time they might play it another. So I think we have to approach this whole topic wanting to know if there are rules, if there are certain guidelines that we should follow, but then how can we use some creativity in applying those in concrete musical situations, and what we want to be thinking about when we try to realize ornaments. And the main question is usually has to do with the trill. Now there are a number of different kinds of trills. You know, there's the short squiggly sign, which scholars now call a trillo, but some 19th century editors called it an inverted mordent. There's that same sign but with a line through it, which we now call a mordent. There's the TR sign. There's a TR sign with a wavy line after it, which usually applies to trilling on longer notes. But the main question is, does every trill have to begin on the upper note, or are there situations in which the trill should start on the main note? Now, Ralph Kirkpatrick, the great 20th century harpsichordist, put out a really nice edition of the Goldberg Variations in 1938. And he wrote a very long introduction. And part of this introduction deals with ornaments. And when it gets to the trill, what he says is, it cannot be too emphatically stated that the Bach trill, and in italics, always begins with the upper note. It's like, oh my gosh, if I start a trill on the main note, I might go to hell or something, right? And it would be nice if we could consider that to always be the case. And you know, he bases that on very good scholarship. There are certain treatises around the mid-18th century that talk about this topic and whether or not trills should begin on the main note or on the upper note. And I think that one source that we often see, and we often see the reproduction of Bach's actual autograph, is the table of ornaments that he wrote for his son Wilhelm Friedemann Bach when Wilhelm Friedemann was 10 years old. It's called the Klavierbüchlein for Wilhelm Friedemann Bach. And he wrote out an explanation, which he called Explikation, of these various trill signs and ornaments. And so I don't know if you have access to a handout, but I don't know if it'll be up there either. But I put it on here, but most of us, I think, have seen this. And the first sign that we were talking about, that little trill sign, Bach calls a trillo. So, and he always uses the note C for to give these examples. So he writes a little trillo over a C, and he has 3 shakes. You know, the British call trills shakes, which I really like a lot. 1, 2, 3. Now, a lot of editors say that it should be on the upper note, but it's only 2. And you often see that. And then there's the mordent that Bach indicates, you know, with the line through the little trill, which starts on the main note and then goes down to the note right below. And then he gets more complicated with other trills. But I would like to focus on this for a moment, okay? If we agree with Kirkpatrick that every trill should begin on the upper note, and a lot of even modern editions now give suggestions, you know, like the Palmer edition, usually in lighter gray, has the suggestion for how to do these trills. And lots of times they're really great. But usually what those editions do is they always start that little trill on the upper note. One example that I would like to show, I think a lot of us know these so-called 12 little preludes for beginners, and the very first one is in C major, right? And so on. But then he gets to this kind of big cadenza passage over a held long note, pedal note. And he has a long string of 16th notes, and then just one of the notes has that little trillo sign. And so if we were going to be dogmatic about what Kirkpatrick says about starting every trill on the upper note, I'll give you the measure before, and we'll see. And so on. Now, this is usually played pretty fast, and it kind of halts the forward motion if we do something like this. Now, there's an edition that was put out by Schirmer by William Mason, and I used this a lot when I was a kid, and it's still a pretty good edition. He gives good examples, I think, good suggestions for expression. But the way he says to do this trill, and he actually writes it out in the score, let me try that again, I'll do it better. Now, there is an advantage to doing it that way. First of all, it doesn't halt the forward motion. And also, the note that has the little trillo over it is, it's part of a descending stepwise figure. If we play it without the trill, and if we start on the upper note, we have that. If we start on the main note, it doesn't break the melodic line if we start it on the main note. So, so the question is, who's right? Who's right about that? Okay? And we'll get to what I think about it in a second, although maybe it's already evident. But there are a couple of other examples that I'd like to focus on. And one is Bach's first invention in C major. Now, it's strange that some editions that are coming out now have a mordent where all the other editions would have a little trill. And so what I'm talking about, if you have a handout, it's 1B. Do we do it like this, which is what the Palmer edition would say to do? Or in older editions that talked about the inverted mordent, which would go like this, it would sound like this. And we could even stick a couple of notes in if we wanted to, but notice that that trill is starting on the main note. And if we played that figure without that trill, it would be this. And then later on, the left hand comes in with that, and he leaves the trill out. Maybe because it's harder to play it with the left hand or something, I don't know. But anyway, that's what we hear when the left hand comes in later. So that figure, now if we listen closely to that figure and play it with the trill starting on the upper note, or if we play it with the trill starting on the main note, or we find that starting on the main note brings out its, it doesn't disturb the melodic character of it the way it does if you have to repeat the note that you're coming from right above in order to start the trill on the main note. Now, some editions now come out and replace it with a mordent, and then it's no problem. But that doesn't seem to be authentic, at least to what I've been able to see. Like, if we look on the second page of my handout, I included Bach's autograph, a little snippet from Bach's autograph score of this first one. And by the way, it's very interesting that this, this autograph has it this way. And you can tell that that inner note of the triplet in this version was added later because it's squeezed in. The handwriting is squeezed right in between. So nobody's really sure if Bach himself wrote that or if somebody else stuck it in later or whatever. But I think if you listen to Glenn Gould's recording of it, he uses that, that triplet. But that's just an aside. The main thing is that the trillo that we're talking about is clearly does not have a line through it. So it's not a mordent, it's a trillo. But the question remains, should we start out on the upper note or on the main note? And if we're well, to quote Dorothy Taubman, if we're enslaved to notation, or if we're enslaved to rules, we might think, well, we always have to start it on the main note. And, you know, it doesn't sound bad, I guess. But to me, it sounds more melodic, you know, especially since the left hand's going to come in later with that, if we start off this way. So my own feeling about a trill in a melodic line, especially if the notes are fairly quick, is that if we've got, if the trill occurs on a note that's in a descending stepwise line, that we can at least consider starting the trill on the main note so that we don't have to repeat the note above in order to follow the rule that says that we have to begin every trill on the upper note, okay? And it's very interesting that different treatises of the time talked about this kind of situation in different ways. There's C.P.E. Bach, who was Bach's second son. There's Friedrich Markburg and Johann Joachim Quantz. And they all wrote treatises, and they all came up with different solutions to how to do this. Do you notice, by the way, that if you listen to recordings of people playing Bach, that all of them do things differently? They don't always do things the same. And so again, that makes you think, well, but isn't there a rule that says that we're supposed to do this or do that, and shouldn't it be clear? But it shows that it's not so clear. So I think what we need to do sometimes is to consider the sources, consider these treatises, kind of have an educated knowledge of the rule that usually a trill begins on the upper note, but that there can be exceptions depending on the musical context. And that's where we can be free to decide. Now, would Bach have been free with that? Well, you know, he was mainly influenced, of course, he grew up in Germany, and so his music is German. But German music at the time was very much influenced by both the French and the Italians. And by the way, when Bach published his Klavierübung, the second volume has, first of all, the Italian concerto, and then it has the French overture. And so what he was doing in that was he was kind of bowing to both of the musical traditions that had an influence on Germany as well. And the Italians tended to be freer. The French, especially people like Francois Couperin and Danglebert and harpsichordists like that, they wrote out tables of ornaments. And they were very emphatic that you always have to do it exactly this way, especially Couperin. He said, if I wrote this, you have to play it this way. But Italians tended to be a little bit freer with that. And so I think we can think of Bach almost as a combination of that he was aware of rules. He certainly wrote out an introductory table for his son. And by the way, we should always keep in mind that it was an introductory table, that it was for a 10-year-old boy, and that Bach's intention was not to say that this is the way it has to be in every situation. And in the table that he wrote out for his son, it just so happens that each note is a long note. But what do you do with a fast, short note, you know? And that table doesn't cover that kind of situation. Now, another example that I would like to look at, well, let me just show you, we're going to jump now to the preludium of the first partita. And that's can be problematic in a number of ways. I'd like to maybe go a little bit backwards with it, though. There's a little codetta at the end of the preludium in the first movement of the first partita. But it sounds like it's going to cadence. So he goes, and then he puts a little tag on, and so on. But according to Markburg, that trill should be done like this, sort of like an inverted mordent. Okay? But then if you look at what Quantz says, he says that the upper note should be tied over a little bit before starting the trill. And then C.P.E. Bach says to start it on the main note and put some extra notes in. So there are three treatises that would treat a situation like that in different ways. So we can make a decision. This is maybe where our creativity can come in and our sense of taste, that we can know what these people said, but then we can make up our minds on what we think is the most musical solution. What I like to do there is kind of what Kvantz says to do. Because that, and certainly if you start on the upper note like the dogmatic Kirkpatrick would say, it would sound like this. But it loses the melodic grace if you do something like that, okay? But the main thing with the prelude of the preludium of the first partita is the very opening figure. Now, even recordings, I've heard people play it like this. But that is absolutely wrong. And the reason why it's wrong, let me put this back on here. Let's see. I think that's, sorry, excuse me for a second. Turn this off for a second. Get this back on here. Okay. The reason why it's wrong is because if we take the trill away, this is what the notation is. So whatever we do with that trill, we have to honor that rhythm. We can't treat it like this. Right? We have to treat it the way it's written. But that makes it a little bit more inconvenient for that trill, because then we don't have as much time to tremble or to shake on it, okay? So what to do about that? Well, if we're very nimble-fingered, we can do it real quick and do it on the beat and start on the upper note. And that might be the best way to do it. But if we have trouble getting all those 4 notes of the trill in that little space of time, mentally we can think that it starts just a little bit early. So we could do something like this. But make sure that we don't treat it like, you know, the last turn of a trill, especially on a long trill, that little turn at the end is called a Nachschlag. We have to be sure we're not treating this as a Nachschlag like this. Because that alters the rhythm that Bach wrote. But, you know, I think people do it because it's easier to do it that way. Especially when the left hand has to do it later on. So we have this. So what we have to do, if we leave the trill out, we have to line the 2 hands up like this. Especially here. Those have to be lined up. So it takes a certain amount of practice to line this up. That. So one solution I have for that is if we think that it begins just a microsecond early, that it might be easier to line it up. But definitely not do this. Okay? In other words, just to make sure that we don't alter this rhythm. And I think you'll find that very often people don't do that correctly. So in a situation like that, what's really important is that we don't disturb the notes that are written and the rhythms that are written in those notes. So the best way to do that, to discover that, is to leave the trill out at first when we're learning the piece or first approaching the piece. And we have to know then that that trill is going to have to fit into that rhythm. Okay? All right, so let's see. I think we have a couple of other situations that we can talk about here. There's always a controversy about long trills. Should a long trill begin on the upper note all the time? Or are there times when it can begin on the main note? Now, it seems like romantics, when they write a long trill sign, they usually assume that it's going to be starting on the main note. But with Bach, it's a tough question, you know? And I would say that there's a certain amount of flexibility with it also in the way that even the first note of the long trill is approached. So if it's being approached from a step above in the line, then we can consider, instead of having to repeat that note again in order to make the trill start on the upper note, it's possible that we can start it on the main note. But when a long trill is in the bass, it seems to me that the trill should begin on the main note. And there's a very interesting example of this, I think, in one of Bach's organ pieces, and this is on page 2 of my handout also. He has the pedal playing this part. Does anybody remember the organist E. Power Biggs? He used to be the favorite of Columbia Masterworks, right? The favorite organist. So his recording of the Dorian Toccata and Fugue for the organ was the first one that I ever heard. And so maybe I'm influenced by that. Sometimes, you know, the first performance we hear of something, we get attached to it, and then it remains our favorite, you know, throughout our lives. Anyway, in this place, what Bach has in the score is that he has one measure where he does this. And then that's followed by 6 measures of a long trill over the E. So this is E, F, E, F. And then he has a long E with a trill sign over it. Now the way that E. Power Biggs did that was this. He just kept doing that. So we have... But you hear many recordings of organists where they do this, and then they do this, you know, back and forth with their feet. But the question is, in the trill in that situation, is Bach just using a shorthand, saying begin it this way and then just continue doing that? Okay? And there are other situations in which he does that kind of thing. Like, for example, a famous example, and this doesn't have to do with a trill, it has to do with arpeggiating chords. In the Chromatic Fantasy and Fugue, he has this. He has this written out. And then he has long chords with the word arpeggio. So basically what that means is, again, he doesn't want to have to write all that out. So he kind of shows you how he wants you to do it, and then leaves it up to you to continue doing that. And so in the, but the trill situation that I was just talking about with the Dorian Toccata and Fugue, what's really interesting to me, besides the fact that we could, the long trill sign is probably a shorthand to just continue what he initially notated, that trill that he begins to write out begins on the main note. And we need a bass note very often. And if we start a bass note from the upper note, we don't really have a feeling of stability, which that gives us a feeling of stability. So to me, that's an indication that when the long trill is in the bass, that we should begin that on the main note. When we have a long trill on the top, You know, I suppose we could think of something like this. And that would sound fine with the upper note starting the trill. But what if we have something like this? Do we want to do? Or do we want to keep the melodic feel of it and begin the trill on the main note because it's being approached downwards by step? So I suppose a way that we could answer this question then about the rule, I would say more guidelines, okay? So my guideline is that generally trills begin on the upper note, but there are exceptions. And it depends on the speed of the line and how fast you have to put in that ornament, how you want that ornament to sound within a melodic line so that it doesn't have a feeling of jumping and disturbing that melodic line. So in order to do that, I think if the melodic line is ascending, usually we begin the trill then on the upper note, because you can then connect that to what's happening when the line is ascending by steps. But if the line is descending by steps, then very often, especially in a fast tempo, it seems to me pedantic to start the trill on the upper note, that it should continue downwards. And so in order to do that, we would start the trill on the main note. So that's something that I use kind of as a guideline in my own playing of Bach to try when I'm faced with this choice of what I have to do with a trill. And then when it comes to should I always begin a trill on the beat? Well, almost always a trill should begin and an ornament should begin on the beat. Sometimes, you know, you hear jazz people that would do something like this. So that's like an inverted mordent, but it starts before the beat. And it sounds great in jazz and everything. And oftentimes you hear people doing that with Bach. But it seems to me that we can come up with a rule for that. And other people have said this too, of course, that, that we should always begin the trill on the beat. Okay? And then if we have a long trill, that again, if the long trill starts on a note that's descending by steps, that we have the choice of starting that trill on the main note. And by the way, there's evidence that long trills could start slower and then gradually get faster. So, and that makes it very, very expressive. You know, if you do something like something like that. And it's very permissible to do something like that on a long trill, to start slower and then get faster. But if there's a trill in the bass, I would say that it should begin on the main note so that we have a feeling of stability in that bass note that we need, I think. Frequently in Bach, different manuscripts have different ornaments. For example, the autograph score of Symphonia No. 5, which we think of it as being highly ornamented. Okay, let me just show you here. Let me get it open for a second. It's the E-flat one. But the autograph score that Bach gave us, that I just showed you with the first invention, sounds like this. But then there are manuscripts by his students that have all these ornaments in them that really lend themselves to the grace and the appeal of this piece. So he adds grace notes and he adds little trills to it, and that increases the effectiveness of the piece. So again, we have a choice, but since his students wrote that version fairly consistently, we can pretty much surmise that they're getting that from the way Bach himself would play that. And that's the other interesting thing, is that composers didn't always write down all the ornaments. They had the feeling that people would supply them because they know the style and they would just do it. And that happens very often at a cadence, you know? So, so we could have something like this. But we can probably assume that Bach would do something like this. But he doesn't always write it. Sometimes he does, sometimes he doesn't. That's another thing where we can have some freedom with the interpretation of that. Then the other thing that I like to think of, too, and maybe we'll conclude with this thought, is that when we have pieces that have repeats, like in the suites, you know, the dance movements in the suites and everything, we don't want to play the repeat exactly the same way as we played it the first time through. So we can think of various ways to make it a little bit different. Maybe we can change the dynamics on the piano a little bit. Maybe we can add some tasteful ornamentation here and there, and that's really where our creativity can come in. So I would say that repeats in pieces can be a real boon for an interpreter, because it can show what our creativity can bring. But a word of caution, we shouldn't overdo it. And maybe especially for pianists, this is important. And I meant to say, you know, when you're talking about harpsichord music, ornaments are almost essential to do some things that the piano can do that the harpsichord can't do. For example, accent a note. An ornament on the harpsichord can give an accent to a note, whereas on the piano we can accent it dynamically. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we need a trill to do that. Notes, long notes last a little longer on the piano than they do on the harpsichord. A long note tends to disappear on the harpsichord pretty quick. And so if they wanted to sustain that long note, they would write in a trill, whereas on the piano it's not always necessary to do that, and especially on the organ as well, because it just sustains the note. But I think that what we need to consider also with the piano is that we have dynamics, which a harpsichordist doesn't have. So we don't always need to do exactly the same thing that a harpsichordist does. And this is my own taste. I don't know how you all might feel about this. But harpsichordists can elaborate more, and it sounds good on the harpsichord, but it doesn't always sound as good on the piano, because we've got something that a harpsichordist does not have, and that is dynamics. And so that is a very important mode of expression, of course, for us on the piano, and that's a whole other world to talk about how we use dynamics in the music of Bach. And you know, one time I was, well, for 7 years I did this weekly 2-hour program on Sunday at the New Orleans public radio station. It was called Bach on Sunday. And so I would have a different theme for each of those programs, you know, focusing on something different. And, but very often I would play recordings of different people playing these pieces that we would be talking about. And so I remember, you know, I would play pianists playing them, harpsichordists, clavichordists, organists playing these things. And I got a very angry letter from a lawyer once in New Orleans saying, "How dare you infect the minds of our young children with the idea that Bach can be played on the piano?" Because it was not written for the piano. And so my response to him was, yes, but in the last decade of his life, Bach was the selling agent for Zilbermann's forte pianos in Leipzig. So, and Bach played forte pianos for King Frederick when he went to visit him in Berlin. And so when we do the musical offering, which was based on King Frederick's theme, you know, Bach probably had a forte piano in mind for that. So that destroys these harpsichord purists, if we can lob that fact to them. But of course, the piano was in its infancy back then. But you know, each instrument brings its own different light to the music. Bach himself loved transcribing music for the same music for different instruments because he loved the idea that it can shine different lights on that music. And so I think he would have been totally delighted with the possibilities of the modern piano with playing his music. But of course, we still want to know something about Baroque, or what the Baroque people would do, and there are all other kinds of considerations, you know, whether to detach or to connect notes, all that kind of thing. All kinds of great things that we can explore in Bach. And maybe that's why I like playing Bach so much, and I love listening to Bach, to hear what other people are doing all the time. It's just an endlessly fascinating thing. So anyway, I hope maybe that might have generated some ideas. I think the main idea is that we don't have to worry about burning in hell if we start a trill on a main note sometimes. Okay? Thank you.